Okay, you guys ready? All right, I think we're going to get going here. Thank you everybody for coming out tonight. This is our fourth public engagement session for the Martin Road Park Recreation Facility. Oh, one if you're listening. Clap twice. All right, so again, thank you for coming. I am James Krzan, the Assistant City Manager here in Ferndale. With me tonight, we've got a whole host of our crew. We've got Matthew Smith from Newman Smith, who is the architect working on this project. Joe Gaccio, City Manager. Lorena Wheeler, Parks and Rec Director. Riley Coleman, our Communications Specialist. Deputy Parks and Rec Director, Robert over there. So we got a whole crew. We're going to go through this and give you some good information. Want to kind of set the tone a little bit here. We're going to go through a presentation, but the bulk of the meeting tonight is planned to be a Q&A, moderated discussion. We are broadcasting this tonight, so we're going to have a little bit of interaction via YouTube. So we're going to be here. We're going to try and answer questions about the project. For those watching online, our intent is to answer questions about the project, but we're not going to weigh in on the comments, beliefs, opinions. So we're hoping for a really productive meeting tonight. So to kick it off here a little bit, reset the origin story, if you will, on the Martin Road Park Recreation Facility. Back in 2022, the city put together a resident-led facilities task force to look at all of the city buildings. One of them they did look at the shuttered concession stand at Martin Road Park, and they looked at that and thought, that we have a need for a city-controlled recreation facility. We have a need to restore some community functions, some gathering space, a public gathering space. We also had a need for concessions and to expand the restrooms from the new splash pad. We put in a splash pad, and the restrooms we had previously weren't adequate to meet the needs for this new facility, so we needed to do something new. Around the same time, we were going through the COVID pandemic. The COVID pandemic brought an unprecedented amount of funding to cities to support local recreation. 2021 federal competitive earmark funding returns. We also, through the ARPA, through the CARES Act, had a lot of opportunity. But most of these opportunities required having site control or ownership. And it also required having something in a community plan to be able to utilize this funding. Luckily, if you recall, we had a resident-led facilities task force, which put this kind of a project in their recommendations in the report. This made us eligible. We received over $700,000 in grant funding from Congressman Levin, and then also our state rep and state senator were able to secure us with $500,000 worth of funding. And also the DNR then gave us over $880,000 for funding that was coming through ARPA sources. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but those ARPA funds are going to be going away soon, and they're going to need to be ready to be spent by the end of this year. So we received about $2 million in grants for this project. We had the idea, we want to act on this recommendation from the task force, and we want to be able to maximize this grant funding. So we have currently been working on an estimated budget of about $9 million. Of that, $2.1 million is going to be from this grant funding, leaving us a gap of about $7 million. Now, part of this early spring, the council made the decision to put on a Headley override millage, part of which is supposed to be earmarked for facilities, for public safety facilities, recreation facilities, and operations. So utilizing this, we would be looking at, we'd need $7 million to finalize this project, which works out to 0.54 mils of this millage to pay off an annual debt payment of $515,000. So what does this mean? This means if you have a taxable value on your home of $125,000, this project itself would cost you annually $67.50. And just a little bit of refresher here, a home with $125,000 taxable value typically has an assessed value of $250,000. And for those who don't know, a little fun data here, 1 mil is estimated to bring in $962,000 to the city of Ferndale right now. But so we talked about the grant funding. We just now talked about the need for additional funding. So what does that look like to this building? So if there isn't additional funding and we have to utilize only the grants, we're going to be looking at a smaller building. What you can see on this slide here, we've got the dark red, which is the building that would be funded and supported by the grants, and then the blue, which is what we would be looking at being able to do if we had additional funding. Yeah, that's what I was doing. The dark red, yeah, so the dark red is the grant-funded portion of this building. The lighter shade of red is other amenities that can be that can be supported by grant funding. So we're talking about parking, walking paths, landscape, and all of that. And then the blue is what we would be able to do with additional funding. And this is just kind of a high-level sketch of this project. But so here we are tonight, 4th public engagement session. We began these sessions back in June 4th. Our first one was at the Detroit Curling Club, where we engaged the community to get a lot of input on what kind of activities and programs we wanted to see in a potential building. We used that format to create a survey to continue to build on that, and we got more information. We had 77 people respond to that first survey we did. We have had incredible participation over the course of this project. June 27th, we held our second public engagement session. Now we started looking at what might the building look like? What kind of things are we looking for in a building? How do we want it to look? How do we want the building to feel? Got really good information, which we then took back and created our second survey. Put out the second survey, we had 91 respondents. All along this project, our plans continued to shift and become different and become better because of the feedback we've been receiving. Public engagement on this has been so good that the project keeps getting better and better with each iteration, and I'm really excited for Matthew to be able to show you guys tonight where we are now. We had our third public engagement session then on August 8th. Here we got even more feedback, and we took the feedback we were getting. A lot of it had to focus on parking and trees and trying to continue to hone in on what this site is going to look like. So for the last 3 weeks, we've been refining that design based on this input, and here we are tonight, our fourth session. And now I'm going to kick it over to Matthew to go through and show you how we've changed it and where we're at.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone, for kind of attending this meeting and kind of assisting and giving us some feedback on what you want the recreation facility at Mountain Road Park to become. I'm going to, can you hear me? Thank you, everyone, for coming out and kind of being a part of this discussion to assist in us, determining, what is wanted of this recreation facility in Mountain Road Park. I know there's a lot of familiar faces in here. Is this the first engagement meeting for anyone in this room? So I'm seeing 5 hands. So in general, I'm going to kind of touch base on some of these things, but from on a general agenda standpoint, what I'm going to go through is kind of a little bit of the past history of both site components as well as design components. We'll have a few interactive questions related specifically to those. And then we're hoping to save the second half of the meeting after 7 o'clock just for open dialogue and exchange of ideas, concerns, likes, dislikes, et cetera at that point. So when I do get into the interactive question area, we may answer a few specific, questions related to that element of the design or that element of the site, but the majority of the discussion we're really going to kind of dive into in the second half of the meeting. For that interactive exchange, you can see some QR codes that are placed throughout the room. And it'll also be up on the screen when that time comes, and simply by, scanning that QR code, it will bring up a interactive survey, so we're able to see all of your results populate live as we're kind of having that discussion and going forward. If you're not in the room and virtually, we will be, showing that when we get to that stage of the presentation. From a high-level review, in case you're not familiar with the project itself, or Martin Road Park in general, the area we're really kind of focusing in on is, this 300-foot radius around the existing splash pad, kind of in the south central to southeast corner of the park. And that 300-foot radius is really determined by EGLE requirements of how far these restrooms and some of these facilities that are required in this and required for the grant funding has to have a certain proximity to that thing. So that red circle, acts as a restriction for, a certain percentage of the spaces that are required in this area. So that limits us, as you can kind of see on the east side, we have an existing baseball slash softball field that kind of borders us on the east. To the north, a little bit out on the northern end of that circle, there's an existing soccer field. To the south and southwest, we have some existing, older growth trees that are in that area. And then one thing you don't actually see in this thing, and I'll explain it a little more in detail, but there's a large county line that actually traverses this site that's, 12 foot in diameter, sanitary line that's 30 feet in the ground. So there's a huge easement that kind of bifurcates, the park that, has some restrictions that we can't build over that. So even though in a lot of cases, particularly to the north and northwest of the splash pad, looks like a prime, lot, that's not practical simply because we can't build over what you don't see underground. Oops. Kind of looking at, zooming in on that a little further, you can see this existing playscape area here. To the west of that playscape area, literally touching the existing shelter space, there's a older triple trunk tree at that location. Arborists come out and routinely inspect these trees and, write an assessment on what is the status of these, what is the likelihood of failure going forward, and concerns that, might be related to safety or structural damage, et cetera. That tree has been classified with a imminent likelihood of failure due to simply the triple trunk configuration. It's just not structurally as sound as some other areas. Likewise, just south of that tree is another tree that has a lot of rot, an existing rot that's located at and that as well, and that likewise has a imminent likelihood of failure on that too. I'm sorry, the larger tree is the smaller tree is an imminent likelihood of failure. The larger tree is a probable likelihood of failure. So with this, we have this existing playground area here. There's a existing shelter there that is going to need some, some significant repairs and so forth going forward. There's a storage facility that currently, supplies, requirements for the splash pad that's directly north of that, and a small restroom facility shown with the green roof here. because both the storage area as well as that existing shelter is going to need some significant repairs in the near future. The thought is that, with the removal of those and incorporation of aspects of those within, this area and some of these existing trees that, regardless of what happens with this project, are likely to failure in the near future, this kind of became, a prime area for, potential development site. With this kind of being said, and just to kind of touch on, this is our fourth meeting. The first one was focused on big picture ideas. What were some of the high level things that, Ferndale meant to you? Some of the aspects of elements you want to see incorporated within, a facility at this location. Key things that kept on coming up, and this was repeated throughout, all of those three earlier engagement things, was really, emphasis on inclusivity and accessibility to all members of the community, incorporating sustainable practices whenever they, made financial sense, really making this a community-focused project and less so of a destination, so really kind of focusing on the needs of, the Ferndale community and those residents that border that park. Emphasis on flexibility, as we kind of dive into some of the spaces that are proposed in this, none of them are, requiring a single use. They're wearing multiple hats, and each of those uses has different demands on it. So it's a consistent push and pull as to, what maintains this flexibility, what satisfies these demands for each of these uses and still functions. So there's a series of trade-offs as a result of that. What could be, great for the flexibility standpoint may have a trade-off regarding to acoustics or something like that. But it's really just kind of, making sure that this, wears, the various multiple hats and, satisfies the various demands of each of the uses that they'll be performing. An emphasis on blurring interior and exterior spaces. Some of these which are actually kind of written within the grant requirements that we're proceeding for. Some of these grants, have a requirement for exterior use. So in a lot of cases, it's not as simple as having a community meeting space, but, that community meeting space has to have, kind of blend and blur that boundary from the interior to the exterior. So that may mean that there's, possibly garage doors or sliding doors, something that really kind of blurs that boundary. So it's not just an interior, meeting space, but really kind of more of a flexible use with that. And obviously, counterintuitive to some of those things, year-round use within these spaces. So even though it's nice to have, open pavilion in the summer months, we only have so many nice days in Michigan, so it needs to be able to, satisfy the demands of, the winter months and so forth as well. In addition, preserving the natural environment, embracing some of the aspects there, preservation of trees, emphasis on, landscaping that, is more natural in nature, there were some aspects of storm water and drainage concerns that kind of came up in this park. But really, rather than kind of treating some of these existing elements as a detriment, really utilizing them as an asset, both for learning, maybe that determines, rain gardens or bioswales, different aspects like that, but really turning them into a feature and kind of a focus point versus something that's kind of a detriment to the project as a whole. And then obviously, minimizing the disruption to the tree canopy as well. And what we're looking at now, from those who were at previous meetings, this is a variation of, kind of the preferred site plan from the previous meeting. Couple of key things that I wanted to point out on it is the pros and cons of this site location. As I mentioned, the community is very sensitive, as we should be, on the preservation of the existing trees. In this case, I kind of mentioned, the existing playground, in this particular scheme, we're proposing to relocate that towards the north. And the thought with that is, even though there's a cost associated with the relocation of that playground, there's cost savings associated with running underground utility lines and so forth in order to make this work. So it's almost offsets actually, as a cost savings with that. I mentioned, in this scheme, there are 2 trees that we are going to end up losing, that both of them have either imminent or probable likelihood of failure in the near future. Both of those are kind of shown, in the middle of this plan, as well as kind of towards the southwest, where you see these 2 trees kind of there to the southwest of the entranceway. So, and other than that, and we're going to get into some of the parking options and so forth in a minute, but really trying to, minimize, how can we avoid as much of the canopies as possible in this location. In general, you see the darker green area. The thought is that this building would be placed in those surrounding spaces. You would have a combination of, that stormwater, bioswales and so forth that, become features surrounding that, as well as natural plantings. And then, a combination of open as well as planted areas, so that you have flexibility, anything from children playing out there and on open lawn versus other areas which may function more as a bee or butterfly habitat, and so forth in these areas. By placing the building here, it's closer to the existing street, which allows street parking on the northern side. That, ends up having a cost savings because you're not running, the additional road, the additional paving, disrupting tree canopies as much, et cetera, by, utilizing some of the existing infrastructure that's there. Also, one concern that came up in a couple of the other community engagement sessions was this clear visibility between the playground and the splash pad. And the thought is that, if you're a young family, you have multiple kids running around, you want to be able to maintain, tracking them at both of those locations without, some form of structure that's blocking that view. One additional thing I want to point out on this thing, on this plan is that in the near future, there's an additional project that is placing a pavilion at the current basketball court that's located just southeast of the splash pad, as well. At that location, there's also proposal that the existing, kind of towards the northwest, there will be a new curling, a new full basketball court in this area, as well as pickleball courts in this thing. So this is, and then in addition, the existing parking lot to the southeast is going to have an accessible route added to that. So this is something that's going to happen, that's going to begin to happen in the next couple of days. That's outside of this project, but we're showing it on this plan just for the sake of consistency as we kind of go forward with this. Going into parking, and I know this has been kind of a contentious debate at some of these previous things, is, this building's being asked to wear multiple hats, function to, a diverse range of residents, many with, obviously different priorities. And I just wanted to kind of sense, because we're going to start talking some distances, but just to get an understanding of what, when I say 50 feet or 70 feet, what does that realistically mean? And in this case, we went and we kind of measured, well, some areas in the community, what is the distance from the front door of those businesses to the first ADA spaces, just so we have kind of a sense of scale. Starting from the northwest, Western Market from the front door on 9 Mile to that first space, 110 feet. Ferndale Foods kind of showing in the lower left here. In this case, the parking lot's directly at that front door, but you do have that drive aisle. That's 42 feet at that location. Kind of upper right, looking at the library, coming from the west, it's about 80 feet. Coming from the east, 75 feet, assuming you're using the closer ramp. If you go up the stairs, that's reduced at that point. And then City Hall, if you're coming from the west, approximately 115 feet. If you're coming from the east, 100 feet. And the reason I'm bringing this up is, at least you kind of have a sense of scale as we start to kind of discuss, you know, some of these options that we're looking at. And, you know, site plan option 1, which is, you know, a variation of what you just seen. What we're really doing on this from the previous iterations, before we had covered patio space, et cetera, on the south side of this building, we're looking at eliminating that, kind of focusing those covered patio spaces more on the northern things. That allows us to shift the building south about 10 feet closer to Orchard Avenue. That still keeps the building outside of the existing tree canopies. Some of the patio spaces and so forth and sidewalks, you know, do start to infringe a little bit, but enough where we think it's not going to be detrimental to those existing tree canopies. And just from a high level, you know, in order to kind of focus on the preservation of the existing tree canopies, ideally we don't want to touch underneath those canopies. Something like a road or foundations, you know, requires a lot of digging, and that's going to be detrimental to the root structure of those trees. And the more you start to infringe on that, you know, the more likely that tree is not going to survive. Some other shallower paving types, you know, sidewalks and patios, you know, they don't go as deep into the ground. They still have an effect on that root structure, but, you know, it's better than putting in curbs and roads and foundations, et cetera. So with this strategy, you know, we're starting to pull the building closer to the road, minimize that distance. Off of Orchard Avenue, we're restricted to how much street parking we could do off of Orchard Avenue, kind of towards the southeast of the building. There's some existing transformers and so forth in that area, plus the existing tree canopies that are very close to the road there. So all we could really fit in there is, you know, designated drop-off at the street, kind of showing at number 10 on this diagram. And then to the east, you know, having, you know, existing street parking on the north side of that road. On the west side of kind of that main access going into the building, you know, we could start to implement some ADA spaces at that point. There's some existing trees that we'd like to work around, so that kind of breaks it up to a degree. And what we're doing in this case is, you know, utilizing the existing street for that drive aisle, and we're just, you know, putting on these perpendicular spaces off of it. There's obviously a cost savings associated with that. But we're really kind of focused a lot of this, you know, parking, et cetera, off the existing road to kind of minimize its impact on some of the existing trees. In this particular case here, looking at distances, the blue circle at that front entranceway is a 50-foot radius. So in this case, your first ADA space is 55 and a half feet away, your second 70, your third's 78 and a half, and your fourth spot's 92 and a half at that spot, just to kind of give you a sense of scale at this area. And, you know, there is, you know, the key advantages to this particular option is you know, minimizing the impact on the natural environment. There is some cost savings associated with it. As I kind of explained before, there are going to be some trees lost that are probably lost. But one thing that we've been discussing internally is, you know, and not specific to, you know, one scheme or another, but when a tree is lost, what do? You have a grove of trees here that are, you know, similar in age. You know, old trees are eventually going to end up failing, and at that point is what precautions are being done in order to preserve that in 30, 40, 50 years, you still have a grove of trees at that site. So one of the things that as these trees are removed is replacing them caliber by caliper with new trees. So the thought is if you have an existing tree that's 25 inches diameter or across the trunk, and your average new tree is anywhere between 2 and 3 inches typically, so you're replacing that 25-inch caliber tree with 10 new 2.5-inch trees. So because of that triple trunk tree and the other one that we're looking at this location, to give you a sense, you know, the triple trunk tree plus the other one, that amounts to 52 22.5-inch caliber trees that we're looking at placing throughout this site. Some of them adjacent to the building, as shown here, and other ones in different designations around, you know, Martin Road Park. You could see, you know, at this stage, Everything's very conceptual, but the key things I want to kind of point out too is that, in this existing grove, infilling some new trees in there so you have a more diverse age of different trees so that, in 50 years, this isn't, this isn't lacking, full growth trees at that point. And then also some other areas that, have been discussed, some of them that are actually going to be incorporated with the improvements at the proposed pavilion, et cetera, but really, around the splash pad, incorporating some shading trees, kind of towards the east of that area, scatter them out where we can. One thing that you don't see is between the softball field and the pavilion, there's a lot of underground stuff going on, so it kind of limits what we could really do in some of these spaces. So with this scheme, really, it's minimizing the impact on, some of that natural environment. We are pulling the building a little closer, lower cost, and when I say minimizing the impact on the natural environment, that we are still going to have to put in sidewalks and so forth, so there always is that risk that something may, some of these other trees, but, that caliber for caliper loss is the rule, so that you're not, we're not replacing a 20-inch tree with a single, sapling or two. It's something more substantial than that. Kind of moving on to what I want to say is option B here. So many of the same kind of factors kind of apply to this as well. The difference is we're shifting this, we're keeping this building further north, away from the street. It's actually in about the same location that was shown in the earlier iterations. But we are introducing a small lot directly, parking lot, which is just for ADA accessible spaces directly southwest of the actual entranceway. And then in addition to that, some of the same improvements that we're looking at doing along Orchard Avenue, including the drop-off location, sidewalks along the curb line in those areas, so you could easily get from the street parking, on the sidewalks and then to these front doors. And then some of the auxiliary parking that's, more so in the area that's called out as 14 is also kind of consistent on this thing. So really what we're doing is keeping the building where we're at. We do get some flexibility if we wanted to increase, some covered areas along the southern side of this thing while keeping those outside of this area, but we're getting parking that's closer to the actual building. There is some additional cost with this. There's likely some additional trees that will be lost simply because now we're cutting roads and so forth off of Orchard Avenue into these areas, particularly the trees that are kind of shown as number 12. Directly along the street line, directly west as well as east of where we're cutting that access point at this thing. Sense of comparison, a distance from the front door to those ADA spaces is, the first space is 23.5 feet, second 36.5, 45, and 55 feet. So you're really getting this ADA spacing, as close as we can to the entrance of this building. But you are going to end up losing some of that natural environment and disrupt some of the existing, a few more of the existing trees as a result of this, likely. One thing that kind of diving in to the specifics of the floor plans and the operations of this is the building as a whole is about 9,800 square foot. And kind of running through, those who weren't here at previous meetings, you notice that a lot of it is restrooms. And this is not, a decision on our behalf, but it's really driven, one, by the splash pad occupancy, which is really requiring, a lot of these exterior-oriented restrooms. So it's something that's kind of, that's a requirement. Within discussions at the previous meetings and so forth, there's, to be inclusive, there's a need to have more single-use restrooms and changing areas versus a shared area, so that, does, add a little more space requirements for, these particular areas. In addition, you obviously have the indoor restroom requirements, and the thought is just the way building codes are set up, in the event that you have an outdoor activity and indoor activity, the building still needs to function. So you don't necessarily get those shared, uses of those spaces. There is some overlap, but not really. So that really drives a lot of kind of this centralized spine of what's happening in this space. From the earlier discussions and engagement meeting, particularly 1 and 2, we asked, what do you want to see in this space? One of the first things was that everyone mentioned this as an extension of their houses, the need for some form of community living room. So almost like a informal lounge space, something that's not programmed, something that, is always available, and you don't have to worry about trying to utilize it and then find out that, a meeting's booked in there or something like that, or a group has, their organization is using that. So that was one thing, is really incorporating, this small community living space, which is shown in the southwest corner of this building. And you can't see it. Do you know if people online actually see this? Or they do see the cursor as well, or just the image, not the cursor? Okay. So in the southwest of the plan, you see this kind of this community living room, which is labeled number 11. Series of operations area, but really kind of the two bulk items of this plan was really flexible community rooms, which are oriented on the west side of this plan with this extension to exterior patios here. And then, so the thought with these areas is about 1,200 square foot that could be divided up into thirds if needed for smaller groups or larger groups. That's the place where if you want to have a birthday party or something for your son or daughter, you're able to rent that space out and you have easy proximity to, the splash pad, the playgrounds, et cetera. For larger groups, if there's a senior meeting going on, they may take up that entire space, and that's what it would be allocated for that. And they also have that, that extension to exterior covered patios and so forth, which we'll kind of get into a little bit there. So that was really kind of, I'll call it smaller community flexible space. And then on the east side of the plan, as labeled as number 1, was a larger event space. And that's where you would have, a larger gathering, a banquet, maybe some form of market function, but really, kind of that much, more significant group. And then that likewise has, blurring that boundary between patios on both the north and the south side of that, and kind of creates an extension of the park in that space. At the front entranceway, kind of leading into this sense of, promoting community interactions. We incorporated some covered spaces there, almost like a front porch there. So that's kind of where you're able to go under coverage, if it's a rainy day, et cetera, and, see people coming off the street, kind of an extension of, this residential character from there. In the centralized core, there's a requirement for a concession space that's located kind of on the inside of this courtyard there. That has an extension, is connected to, a catering kitchen that provides, both the larger event space and possibly, if needed, the smaller flexible community spaces. In addition, we spoke about having a small kitchenette accessible from those community meeting spaces. So if you're having a party and you need to keep something warm or cold, you have that flexibility without actually going in a full-blown kitchen at that area. As I mentioned, incorporating single-use restrooms, one with a adult changing table was discussed earlier on. So it's kind of all-encompassing, satisfies the various needs of different members within that communities in that space. Surrounding it, as I kind of mentioned, we have, kind of these more formalized patio spaces that are extensions of the building, but also kind of creating, more of these natural walkways that kind of encompass some of the landscape areas surrounding these areas. So that's something where we could, you could implement more of an educational tool, whether it's, explaining, a butterfly garden or a bee garden, whatever the case is, where there's natural wildflowers and so forth, but really kind of emphasizing this as an education tool. And with that, I'd like to kind of, if everyone could scan this if you haven't already, and really want to just have a question regarding the site direction, and then from here, we're going to kind of just keep the discussion to the specifics related with these two. And then we have a whole design component that we'll follow up, which is more based on the building design, which will be followed by a series of questions. And then, as I mentioned, opening this up for a general discussion. So. Okay. That's me. What was the code here? Tab function? Oops. Okay. So with that, and with this, if someone could verify that they're able to see the first question pop up, and really the preference is do you have a preference towards site option A or B? In summary, site option A was the one that shifted the building closer to Orchard Avenue. It incorporated, pull-off areas with parking using Orchard Avenue for circulation there. Less impact on some of the existing trees and their canopies. A little less cost associated with this. Option B being where we keep the building further north off of Orchard Avenue and we start to introduce a designated ADA parking directly off of that front entranceway at that location. And I also included, an either option if you're indifferent, and then an either option, which we're getting into the specifics of discussion points if the preference is the neither option when we get into the discussion in the second half. Yes. Function or? Tab Alt. Okay. Oh, the simultaneous. Okay. Is there anyone in the audience that's not able to sign in on this or hasn't had an option? I see we have 17 responses. I don't know, how many people do we have online? 14 people online? And I'm going to leave this on here for a little while. We'll kind of dive in a little bit more of the discussion as we go on. So you'll be able to fill this in if you still need some time. And with that, I'm going to kind of start the design portion of this thing just for the sake of time. And then, as I mentioned in the second half, we're really going to dive into some of the, in general, at this point, it's the majority is in favor of the option A, minimizing the impact to kind of this natural environment and keeping most of the parking allocated towards the street. And then kind of starting to look at, an extension and kind of refinement of some of the building design areas that we looked at in the engagement session number 3. From the previous sessions, we had, we did a series of collages where people, posted notes on, different imagery, that they liked and they didn't like, certain aspects of design that they liked and they didn't like. After we asked a series of questions, you kind of start to see these underlying, factors that kind of resonate from, majority of the group, and kind of touching on some of those. One thing that kept coming up is that, this is a residential neighborhood. There's, outside of the school, it's all housing kind of bordering this area and the church. So there was always this emphasis to keeping this at a human scale, a residential scale, nothing grand, nothing that kind of stood out. When we discussed materiality, there was this preference towards more natural, warmer finishes versus, more utilitarian and colder finishes. We asked about, incorporation of artwork throughout this, whether it be for murals, sculpture, etc. And the general consensus was that, art and creative expressions need to be incorporated, but it doesn't necessarily need to be the focus of this project. And then also just from when we talk about the sustainability, there's obviously environmental sustainability, financial sustainability, and other elements, but when we looking at long-term maintenance, durability, sustainability, and, associated cost with maintaining the facility was something that needed to be considered, various design decisions that would be made bringing this forward. And then also just kind of keeping the project cost conscious and simple. At the previous meeting, I presented two different options, very different kind of approach. The one concept, the one that's shown here, was focused on more or less a abstract version of your typical residential house with emphasis on these gables, a little bit more of a modern interpretation, simpler, cleaner lines. But looking at that, and then one thing that kind of came from some of the earlier discussions is that there was, how can we take this 9,800 square foot facility and make it look smaller, make it look more residential. So one of the thoughts was that, well, why don't we try to break it into different pieces? And in this case, or in both of these cases, we looked at, okay, well, making it look like a cluster, almost like a campus of different buildings, and that being, focused on, the community flexible rooms located towards the west, as well as this larger event space towards the east, and then kind of keeping that centralized spine that kind of runs through the center of the building as, a lower, simple, flat roof structure, and then that really kind of housing some of these more utilitarian needs and requirements for it, whether it be the kitchen or the restroom facilities and so forth. So kind of breaking it up into a couple of different components to, minimize the scale of it. The lower option, more contemporary approach to it, but really kind of looking at these subtle shed roofs, kind of keeping these lower overhangs, and emphasis a little bit more so on, the natural, whether it's faux wood materials, warmer materials with that as well. And from both the previous meeting as well as discussions and meetings that happened since that engagement session number 3, the preference was towards concept 2, which is the lower one on the screen. Here I'm just showing kind of those same two concepts, but from the park view, and looking at, kind of those elements where you have, this more defined roof structure kind of on the left side of the screen with the more simpler, utilitarian wing kind of on the right side of the screens. Once again, concept 2 was the preferred option between these. We also started to ask about different materiality and color schemes with both of these projects. And here, color option at the top, where we ultimately had more of a browner tones, buff tones, masonry with the natural wood was preferred over, more of the redder tones and, the buff tones kind of shown in the lower one here as well. We looked at a couple of different, simplifications of that form. The top option obviously has a lot more wood accents along the top sections of the more community-focused event and gathering spaces, and both the event space as well as, the community living space and meeting areas, with also, the emphasis on the middle of these two, and then the lower one being, more focused on masonry materials from a durability standpoint, and really kind of keeping, these 4 wood accents focused on, in this case, the entry element kind of coming in the center. The lower option was the preferred one, 50%, and with this, over about 30% for the upper one. And with this, there were multiple options in there if you like both options and so forth, which isn't, called out in this particular percentage slides. We did a series of renderings focused on murals, and going back to what was kind of reiterated from some of the earlier meetings was, really incorporation of artwork without it necessarily being the focus. There was, and that was followed by expectation of having both interior and exterior artwork on the thing, and then the third preference was just on the exterior of the building. So really, incorporation of art, but that not necessarily being the main goal of this facility. Overwhelmingly, when we asked about covered spaces and, the extent of exterior covered spaces, lower option was 71%. Everyone really wanted to maximize, these exterior patio spaces, these exterior covered areas, and, kind of these extensions of, in this case shown here, the extension of that community living room and those flexible community spaces, on the west side. So going from, what came out of, those various questions that we asked about different aspects of the design. Another thing that I did not mention was that, there was a little bit of a conversation at the last meeting regarding, well, we need to add some color to this, some form of accent that, kind of makes it unique to Ferndale. And these next few slides is kind of where that design's evolved into, carrying aspects from those previous iterations. The biggest thing worth noting is that, that emphasis on, in this case, we're showing, kind of that Ferndale green, delineating, these key entry points going into the building. In this scheme, and we're kind of going to some discussion about what exactly that accent wants to be, but really kind of creating, that destination point, that focal point at, these key entrances into the space. A couple other things I wanted to focus in on is, obviously the expansion of the exterior covered patio spaces, and this one, off the community meeting rooms on the left side of the image. We increased the amount of masonry on this thing and, kind of focused on that, that wood element or 4 wood element really in the canopies underneath, some of these covered exterior spaces, as well as, at these entry elements, where it's a little more pronounced, having that wood feature there as well. Couple of aspects regarding artwork. In this case, we have an interior mural on that wall, that behind that transparency. So the thought is at night, et cetera, that mural will be illuminated from the inside, and that kind of creates a feature, that you see from Orchard Avenue to the south. Looking at the backside of this, kind of a continuation, the extension of emphasis on those exterior covered elements to kind of increase, the use of those spaces, the green fins delineating, key entry elements, at both, this concession / exterior restrooms area, as well as some of the other key entry points. And then, strategically placing, artwork, at areas that are, key viewpoints from, the multi-use pathway, whether you're coming from the east or you're coming from the west, kind of showing at the edge of the event space on the left side of this image, as well as, at the kind of the northeast entry, on the right side of this element, and then also kind of defining, that kind of that central, concessions area where you have this courtyard that starts to be formed around that. And with that, I'm going to actually better off with the mouse in this, huh? Is there another way, or can I actually do it with yes. So regarding kind of the last few images, I've kind of gone through, this was a progression of various, questions we asked at the earlier iterations and kind of combining some of those things. And the general question is regarding this current iteration of the building to design, what's your preference of approval or disapproval? Is it something that's overall approved, somewhat approved, disapproved, or overall disapproved? Overall disapproved. Is there a way I could just use the mouse? And then I'm just going to kind of flip through these slides again, looking from the street view as well as the park view. And as you're kind of starting to kind of follow up on that, moving on to some options associated with those various things. And this is something that, the top view, we have a variation of what I previously shown you, except having more of an emphasis on the darker masonry, whereas the lower one, option 2, which I previously shown, has that emphasis on the lighter masonry. And really what we're doing is because we're treating, these outside elements being that larger event space and the kind of that community flexible use space on the left side here, we're really just kind of, do we want those to be the darker elements and then the lighter centralized elements, or vice versa? And with that, kind of transition to that question, so you're able to kind of answer what color configuration your preference is, and maybe open that up. Oops. And the top one being more of the darker elements, and then color option 2, and then there's also options in there if you don't prefer either option or you're indifferent between those two options. And as people are finishing up on that, this is the rear view of that same exact, those two schemes. Obviously in this particular view, because that community flexible use spaces are kind of hidden behind the service core, it looks like there's, a little bit more of that element that's pronounced at this point. And then the next thing is kind of looking at, well, what do we want that accent to be? The incorporation of color, et cetera. And a few options kind of looking at, the accent option number 1 kind of being, that thin element that, defines these entry points. Option number 2 to the lower left, eliminating that thin element and doing something simple where we don't have the accent element. We're really just kind of focused on that wood canopy as that delineation of that front entrance. Exit number 3 to the upper right corner, where it's a bolder move with the color, where rather than having the wood element, we're entirely just going to focus on this accent element, defining these some of these covered spaces. And then the lower right one, looking at kind of a more of that accent kind of continuing throughout, various areas of the project, one through the columns at the entranceways and some of these other covered spaces, as well as starting to implement it on some of the roof lines and so forth. So that accent color is something that's more prominent, carries around, but doesn't really, focus in on one particular element, defining an entry, something like that on the design. And I'm going to switch to the other view. So just kind of a recap, it looks like the preference is toward the more light masonry. And then regarding the accent color preferred, and what the general preference is on that. And while some people are kind of reviewing some of those areas, just wanted to talk a little bit about the extent of artwork on the project. In this case, we positioned, different murals. Also notice throughout the landscape, we've always kind of identified potential sculpture garden opportunities, that could be prevalent in this space. But really looking at, in the sake of, these murals, we delineated one at the main entrance point, kind of this interior-exterior combined mural. And then looking from the parkside elevation, defining the concessions area, kind of the centralized area of this courtyard, as well as, these key elevations that you would see when approaching it from the actual bike path, whether it be from the east or the west. One of the things that came up in earlier discussions is that people will be approaching this project from multiple angles. And, not necessarily just from vehicular things. There's a lot of foot traffic. There's a lot of bike traffic. Earlier on the site plan, which I didn't call out a lot, but, we do have designated bike racks in both of the key entranceway to accommodate that, and so forth. And then just kind of a recap of the accent color. It looks like it's either the preference of the accent fins and secondarily looking at no color accent and less of a emphasis on, kind of extending that accent throughout, the building as well as the canopy. So regarding the artwork, I guess the question is this, an appropriate amount of murals and creative expression on the design? Is it too much? Is it too little? And what your thoughts are on that? It just seems like the majority says either appropriate, followed by not enough. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to James, and then we're kind of open it up to a overall general discussion.
Yeah, so we're going to get into a Q&A in a minute here, but we just kind of want to prioritize here. We received this grant funding, and we have no intention to return it. So there will be a facility built. Whether the size and the functionality of it is going to depend upon what happens in November, but there will be improved restrooms, storage space, and some concessions to help support the splash pad. So just want to reiterate that with this, and kind of putting where we're at right now and why we're pushing pretty hard on this project. We're at a timing moment here where we are going to need to have some of this funding obligated. Obligated means we've basically placed an order to spend the money. So we have a contract with somebody who's going to be pushing this project forward by the end of this year. We have until the end of September to spend one of the grants that we've received. We have until the end of 2026 to expend the Spark grant, and then until the beginning of September 2031 to expend that HUD funding that we received as part of the federal earmark. So we are running into deadlines, and that is partly why we're pushing so hard on this. So our next steps over the next month here, we're going to be finalizing the concept, and we're going to be presenting a budget report to the City Council. During that time, we're going to be preparing and putting out RFPs for what's called design build services. This way we can get somebody under contract who can put together the construction drawings, put this project from concept to reality. And then November, December, we're going to have to obligate the grant funds for the grant portion of the project by the end of the year. And the final site plan is really going to be based on the voter input in November. So with that, that is what we have for our prepared presentation. But tonight, it's about you. So we want to hear your questions. We're here to answer them. I do want to, again, we are broadcasting, so if somebody shouts from the back, we're not going to hear it. We're going to be going around with a microphone or two. So with that, happy to open it up to questions.
Yeah, yeah, there's always an issue of funding, and there's a phenomenon that I become more acutely aware of as far as different structures, residential and also non-residential, where some of the funding didn't go back to the city, like I think the parking structure and other residential structures. And I'm not sure what it's called, but as far as the developer would get endless income and nothing back to the city, and I don't know if that's even appropriate with this kind of a park structure or not. But as far as generating the income back to the city, if there's any events or any contracts with any of that with the building or events. So I'm not quite sure what the name of that is, but that's a concern of mine.
Thank you. So just to clarify, this is a public facility, so it would be a public parks and recreation facility. Any programs that we hold out of that facility, all of the revenue comes back to the city and so to our budget. Yep, so it's even if we have outside individuals or companies or whoever wants to use or rent the facility, they would then go through our process to rent it. And again, those funds will come back to our department and to the city. That answer your question? Okay.
Another question here in the back.
Okay, quick two questions. On the trees that we're planting, what trees are we going to plant? Because I see Pleasant Ridge took down a bunch of trees, but all I see is the tree of life planted on Woodward. So I'm just wondering what trees are we going to plant if we're, thinking about Michigan natives and whatnot. My second question is what are the hours going to be of the community center? So if I wanted to rent it from, 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., is that possible? Or is it you can only rent it from 8 to 5 p.m.? What are the community hours and what are the rent hours?
So I'll start with the second question first. So typically when we had a facility prior, for the rentals, when someone rents the facility for a specific time, which normally it ends around 10 p.m., we will have a staff person that will come and be there for that rental outside of our normal hours. So sometimes we have rentals on Saturdays or Sundays in the evening or through the day, and if we're closed, we would have somebody there for that. And part of the rental fees pays for that person. And the trees,
Short answer to the tree question, to be determined. It will be some form of native tree. Right now, many of those trees in that area are variations of oaks, so that's probably appropriate, replacement for some of those. But I think it's going to be something that it's going to probably vary depending on where it's located in the park and what the long-term goals are for specifically what they're trying to accomplish in those areas. So maybe something different where we're replacing kind of that existing older growth tree area versus something that we're planning on lining a, sports field or something like that with.
All right, what other questions?
As we know, we're a small community, and DPW works very closely with Parks and Recreation. Is there a plan already in place? Let's say we do pass the millage, what facility, who will be taking care of these facilities? Obviously, it's going to have to be a team effort. Are there plans in place yet for funding for this? More people in DPW? I know they have had lots of turnaround, and it's a small community. This could take a lot of bathroom cleaning and things, people just to be there day in and day out. I'm wondering, do we have funding for that, and if there has been a plan set in place?
Yes, actually, that would be part, is that working? That would be part of the millage, actually. The millage proposes to dedicate the 4 mills that is the increase to facilities and the operations to support those facilities. So the actual earmarking of funding the facilities maintenance is within the millage question.
So my question is, at what point will we know for sure which of those options, the smaller or larger, is happening, and how will that be communicated to us?
Well, I think the simple answer on that is we'll know based on the Headley Amendment. Oh, yep, you need the, hold on.
Sorry.
Thank you, Jenny.
Will there be some sort of formal communication, and when could that be expected?
Pending voter input, if there was a yes scenario, we would still have to obligate those funds, right? So we will have the design build documents already in place. If there's a yes scenario, then the construction documents for the millage portion of the facility would be put forth. Because this is a public facility, I insist that we present it to our own planning commission for review, for feedback, right? And then that site plan be shifted out to council for final approval. So there would be a public approval process, which is, I think, what you're getting at.
Are the Parks and Rec offices going to remain? Is there any plan for the Parks and Rec offices to move as part of this?
We'll both tag team this. So there's grant restrictions on the actual funding restrictions on office space for staff, but there is a rec outpost, of course, because we are going to be activating the space. So we have designed space for some rec staff to be there to serve the building, the facilities, and the greater park programming needs. The larger Parks and Recreation office, they still need a home. Right now we're renting it in Cubizo. That's kind of the next plan for us. Did you have anything? No, so for those at home, I'm Joe Gaccio, the city manager.
Okay. Any other questions? Are we getting any questions we need to answer from online? Yeah, please.
This good? Okay. So someone is asking, is there going to be like a citizens committee for this? I assume we could kind of refer people to the Parks and Recreation Commission. Is that like a good place for that?
The Parks and Recreation Commission, we also have had representation from our resident facility, the Ferndale Accessibility and Inclusion Advisory Commission. the Parks and Rec Commission and Planning Commission as we've been going through this process.
And then I think we covered a little bit of this, but if we could go back to the trees, what are the full growth dimensions of the trees that are going to be replaced? And are we replacing 40-foot trees with smaller decorative trees?
So the two trees, I'll let Matthew get into this more.
I immediately don't know the specific dimensions because we're really talking about a triple trunk tree and a single tree, so it's technically, it's two trees, but it's actually 4 different caliber things. Just from the 5 times 52, it works out, the combination of those 4 trunks is 130 inches, or maybe slightly less. I don't have the specific caliber of each.
So according to the data I have, the triple trunk tree, and I'm not sure if each trunk is 33 inch diameter, but that would sound about right.
There is a breakout on one of the site plans I seen, which is where we took that information from that listed each one.
And the second tree is 35 inch diameter. So hopefully that somewhat answers the question. And the trees that are going to be planted will eventually, they're going to be young when we plant them, but they will grow. That's it. Oh, we've got another one.
Not a real question. I just want to say I do appreciate what you guys have done, all the questions you guys have answered, all the concerns you've met. So that's all. I just wanted to say thanks.
Well, I guess if there are no other questions, that's probably about the best way we can end it on a high note there. So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you everybody who's participated in either a survey or one of these sessions. As I said earlier, it really continues to make this project better, and it's really appreciated. So thank you much. I think that's it for tonight.
Thank you.